Let me introduce our esteemed panelists and researchers and analysts first of all, and then I'll make some comments to start us off. Ahmed, you've heard from in the beginning session, busy day. Ahmed is a research fellow in the Africa program at Chatham House, and his work focuses on the politics of Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. He has been producing policy-driven research that influences thinking on the Horn of Africa, and he is the research lead for the Sudanese borderlands case study for the XCEPT program. Joseph is here. Joseph Diing Majok is a consultant researcher with the Rift Valley Institute. He has been working with RVI since 2017 and has been involved in numerous projects with XCEPT, having written and co-authored reports, policy briefs and blogs on cross-border livelihoods, labour migration and militarisation. Joseph holds an MSc in Africa and International Development from the Centre of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Ikal, Angelei, is with the founding director of the Friends of Lake Turkana. She's an environmental thinker, activist, philosopher of science, and ecological policy advocate who has interest in environmental justice, resource governance, and community rights. Ikal is the Goldman Environmental Prize winner 2012 for her environmental justice work to protect Lake Turkana, its ecosystem, and the communities. Ikal is collaborating with the Institute for Development Studies on research across the Kenya-Uganda border under the XCEPT Research Fund Award. Working with Ikal together is Simon Longoli. Simon is the Executive Director of the Karamoja Development Forum and a UN Human Rights Fellow. Simon is collaborating with the Institute of Development Studies on research across the Kenya-Uganda border under an XCEPT Research Fund Award also. And last but not least, Dr. Tobias Hagmann is a Senior Programme Officer at Swiss Peace and a Fellow of the Rift Valley Institute. He has 25 years of experience in academic and applied research on politics and trade in the Horn of Africa, and he led a 6-year collaborative research project on trade and state-making in the Somali territories, 2013 to 2019, and also led parts of the Somalia-focused work by RVI for the XCEPT program. He is a former Associate Professor of Development Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark, a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and an editorial board member of African Affairs. So as you can see, we have a packed panel, which means that we're going to be as concise as we can in order to facilitate the discussion. As you can see, some very busy people were busy at lunchtime moving the room around so that we could have a more facilitated discussion and get your comments, questions, and inputs. I just want to make 3 points that really wrap around this research that you're going to hear about this afternoon. And those are the way that we look at borderland economies. So how do we look at borderland economies? The centrality of borderland areas in state building, and I'll come back to these points a bit more. And also the importance of understanding movement of people, which is crucial to these borderland economies. And we are focusing as much as anything on these local economies. They are political economies, they are conflict economies. Let me say a bit more about those 3 points. So the way we look at borderland economies and borderland areas, there are 3 different ways. Formality and informality, what does that distinction mean? Is it meaningful? A lot of what we understand to be informality is highly ordered. Regularity and irregularity, and this refers particularly to taxation and revenue making. So there is a regularity that people working in these contexts and are affected by these dynamics understand. And then in understanding those 2, we also think about order and disorder. So what looks like a disordered environment, what looks like a chaotic borderland is actually highly ordered for those who participate in those economies. As I mentioned, paradoxically perhaps, is the centrality of the border areas in state building. So border economies, border communities, their routes and the corridors are integral and perhaps even play an outsized role in state building when we think about these spaces. And we know that control of these spaces has economic, political, and security, military benefits and motivations. And lastly then, and these are, as I say, these are themes that speak across the research that you're going to hear, and I hope we keep coming back to try to understand these better. So the importance of understanding the movement of people, including vulnerable groups. We haven't talked enough about gender. We haven't talked enough about marginalized groups, but is crucial to these borderland economies. So those who profit from this movement of people and goods are national and sub-national actors, including revenue collectors in many different guises and also types of revenue, as well as more obviously malignant forces like militias who operate in what are these often less well-governed spaces. I think the last important thing to mention is that it's important to see these local economies and local political contexts as their own contexts. So not just as a lens on looking at a larger federal politics or larger structural challenges. Yes, it's true that these are often mirrored in the peripheries, but it's also very much the case that they have a very localized political economy, very localized economies, very localized movement of people that drives these borderland areas. So I hope those are some thoughts that help us think about, in a broader sense, what you're going to hear about. But really, these are the experts. You're going to hear about some of these issues in a very localized way and in the contexts in which our researchers have brought these ideas out. So hand over to Ahmed.
Thank you, Hannah. And good to see everyone turning up after lunch as well. So my point is going to focus on our research, which is examining conflict supply chains related to critical commodities on different areas of Sudan's borderlands and how these connect to conflict. So one of the supply chains we're researching focuses on contestation over control of land, and then very critical agricultural commodities on the Sudan-Ethiopia border region. We're narrowing down this focus to the cash crop of sesame as an illustrative tool. But this is, as many people will know, a very valuable cash crop to the economies of both Sudan and Ethiopia and to the specific localities across the West Gondar, Humera, and Gedaref and Kassala, across those borders. So, I mean, in terms of how we're framing our research, I use this term supply chain, which is featured across different case studies across multiple geographies, covering 3 case studies in Chatham House's research for XCEPT. And so taking very much a political economy approach to understanding how a certain commodity interacts with, it shapes conflict systems, as well as engages and interacts with and impacts communities at local, subnational, national, and transnational levels. And we really want to try and understand through this research how shifts in one part of the supply chain can have an impact and consequences that contribute to conflict across the supply chain in different parts of the supply chain. So this is our aim with our research. And in trying to kind of broaden that out, we're looking at the pathways through the contestation of land and the flow of these commodities within the geographies that we're focusing on. We're looking at how political and security shocks and then the regionalization of these issues, as we've touched upon in the first session, impact these economic activities along key points along this supply chain. And how they reshape communities, coping responses along the supply chain, who is able to take part, who is excluded, and for what reasons. And then thinking about what lessons can be drawn from this analysis of this conflict system and the supply chains that feed from them to inform more effective policy responses. That's the hope at towards the end of the research. So at the moment we're in the stage where we're building a picture. We're building a picture of the supply chain, trying to understand who is involved, the actors involved, political, business leaders, security forces, local populations, and to what extent they're working within the supply chain, be they farmers, be they local bureaucrats, and how this involvement, particularly in this one supply chain around sesame, leads to conflict outcomes, I should say, that sustain conflict at subnational levels, local levels, internally, and also shape engagement and have impacts at the subnational and the national and transnational level. So I just thought I'd kind of highlight and take out a few of the things that have come through the research. And I should say my colleague Abel came into the room, and we are very closely. Abel was also speaking in the first session, a part of the research leading on the work that we're doing on the Ethiopia side of the supply chain. So, I mean, looking at the local level, what we are determining and what is coming out is that securitized approaches to the control of shared land, to trading routes, certainly within this border area, have led to an increase in informal and illicit trade, more likely to harden relationships across, fluid and porous borders, as well as those between communities. And they're also linked to other activities which sustain conflict, including smuggling of people and movement of people, weapons in specific context of northern Ethiopia and Sudan, and other high-value goods. We see that certainly the war in northern Ethiopia and Tigray and sort of neighboring regions, as well as that being correlated to the takeover of land by in Al-Fashaga by Sudanese armed forces just after the war had began, and the displacement of populations, Ethiopian largely populations who farmed this much of this territory east of the Atbara River, is leading to and has led to increased smuggling, not only of agricultural products, including sesame, but as I mentioned, other related commodities, and doing so through the Sudanese border, and interestingly, the research has found that also trading avenues opened up through the Amhara region or Amhara-controlled Western Tigray and Eritrea. One of the interesting things that has come out is that we can point to is some of the pricing data. So if we look at sesame prices before and after the war started, this has dropped from between 6,000 to 8,000 birr per quintal, 100 kgs, to 1,200 birr per quintal. And this is, a direct result of the breakdown of the value chain, which has led, had a huge livelihoods impact, fueled the desperation of farmers during a protracted war in the north. And this internal conflict in Wolqait and Humera has impacted the supply chain and production. Formal roads blocked during the harvest season. As we say, that the kind of the reorientation of the market as well. And I think there's lots of evidence coming from this at the moment, even showing some kind of transactional business that's taking place between parties at war, which is contrary to some expectations. So we've seen the movement of arms related to this, based on foreign currency that's being produced, and these are things that we're trying to look more into, including movement through the Amhara region to Tigray in a way that you wouldn't have expected during the conflict, purely for of course business and transactional reasons. But so this is kind of the detail of some of the work that we're doing. But I think one of the things that I wanted to emphasize also is that's coming out of the research and the interviews that are taking place locally in those areas is that the mutual dependence and resilience of cross-border communities. The social connections are important on the Ethiopia-Sudan border. There are arguably stronger connections across the border than with central or regional governments. You have a traditional social systems there where communities share ethnicity, norms, culture, lands, and reside there together. And you have generations of intermarriage tying communities together, and particularly in Gedaref state. You have economic interdependence as well, with local business owners playing important roles in maintaining relations between, Sudanese and Ethiopian counterparts in Al Fashiga, not only to maintain markets, to ensure that there, is a source of seasonal workers to cover labor shortages in the state, but you also see this impacting and affecting conflict resolution mechanisms and peace between cross-border communities where there is high level of volatility. So some interviewees confirmed that the reopening of Metemma Gallabat border point last year, for example, wouldn't have been possible without local business and other community efforts in applying pressure to the local government, state, and the national level as well. And the other point being that local economic actors are extremely resilient and adaptive. Illicit economic activity and smuggling is, of course, a revenue source for local elites through taxation, traders, the movement of people and revenue from illicit business. But to ensure this is taking place, local business people are obviously cooperating with people from the community who are smuggling and see this very much as a, they do not see the distinction between licit and formal and informal in this regard. Okay, I will stop it. There's a lot that we can go into. I guess I had a concluding point which I wanted to make around the cross-border contestation for control of land and agricultural production. This is very historical, and I guess that historical analysis needs to be fed into the local dynamics at current. And we've had periods of cooperative, shared land use arrangements and conflict shaped by internal political dynamics and bilateral relations between both countries for over a century. And the point being that conflict in one location is never isolated. It's connected to other local, subnational and transnational dynamics. And a key element for policymakers to reduce this violence, build stability over time, is to understand these interconnections, these wider cross-border dynamics, and how interventions in one area can also have knock-on effects and across the chain. And this is the work that we're trying to elicit through the research we're doing for XCEPT. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ahmed. Diing, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed, for your presentation. My intervention will so much complement the presentation Ahmed just made. And I will talk about my work with Rival Institute South Sudan office on the South Sudan cross-border conflict, trade and migration. So the map you see here is the map of the border between South Sudan and Sudan, and my talk will focus on the border between Northern Bahr Ghazal state in South Sudan and Abyei administrative areas with East Darfur states and Western Kordofan states in the Sudan. So the line you see across the borders between South Sudan and Sudan are the routes that connect the communities between across the borders where mobility, whether for trade or labor migration, do happen. The lines, the dots represent, the dot inside South Sudan represent settlement, rural markets and town where trade do happen between communities across the borders. And the dot inside Sudan are important towns where migrant young men from South Sudan find work, whether in towns or whether in agricultural plantation inside Sudan. And this borderland for decades, in 1990s, when the Sudan People Liberation Army is split in 1991, so many militias emerged across the borders, and the family controlled this border for so long until today. So in the nutshell, this borderland has been highly securitized and family controlled by malicious organizations run by individual powerful generals and their family members. Today, the Rapid Support Force control the northern part of the border. Inside, the Sudanese territory, and the private militias affiliated to the South Sudan People's Defense Force control the border on the southern part of the country today, and they still firmly control it. These militias are interested in tax, which they raise through collection from migrants, traders, and also anything that across the border. They also maintain a strong network of smuggling arms across the border, especially from the south into Darfur, where they sell arms to cattle keepers inside East Darfur or Western Kordofan. There are also a strong network being maintained by these militias across the border in smuggling migrants through Darfur into Libya, where they would take a desperate journey into Libya. And until the recent conflict in Sudan, this network of smuggling young men to take desperate journey was so strong across the border, and they do it purposely to raise money to fund their own organizations. Another thing is that illicit goods and also other goods that are prevented by the Sudanese government not to be exported into South Sudan can also be smuggled across this border for sale. So control of borderland space is not only as a source of economic power for this elite, but also as a source of military and political powers and influence. Elites who control borderland is paid to recruit labor migrant young men to build their malicious forces to negotiate their position in the center. And also they do appoint their family members, the kin members, and also their loyalists into the local government position in order to win political influence across the communities living across the borders. So it's another important thing where militias always want to control this space. However, though it is a highly securitized borderland, local communities continue to navigate these challenges to migrate across it because the benefit of moving and trading outweighs the risks. So you see that there are a strong deployment of security forces on both sides of the border, but you can see that many people migrate across this border, especially before the war broke out in Sudan. There were two-way migration of traders, of labor migrants, and also people who are seeking medical checkup in Khartoum and other towns in the Sudan. This means that cross-border mobility of people and goods is important for local economic and livelihood resilience of both sides between these communities. One example is the household members generate money income through sales of their animals. For example, the communities in northern Barghazal sell their animals to traders from Sudan who would export them further to other towns in Western Sudan or up to Khartoum or beyond. And so local communities would sell their animal where they generate some money to fund education for their kids or buy food. So some households also send their young men seasonally to go and work on the palm plantation and send back money to fund their household living costs. Local women in northern Barghazal as well also trade in these settlement and rural towns. They can erect tea stall where they can sell tea. They can also sell second-hand clothes across this. And it's an informal economy that is very essential in their livelihood resilience. And so it's one of the roles it did play. Because of deeply rooted and political animosity between the people in northern Barghazal and also in East Darfur, given the long civil war, this trade across the border is a peg that pulled these communities to each other, and it plays a fundamental role in keeping peace, in maintaining peace across the border between these communities, because they feel that they have to come together to trade, as it is important to both of them. However, the recent outbreak of armed conflict in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan have negatively impacted this cross-border mobility and trade. Seasonal labor migrants cannot go to Sudan to work on its agricultural plantation anymore. That means that we have a vast number of young men who are currently unemployed and they have no other option to find work. Another thing, sales of livestock and locally produced material to traders in Sudan has also stopped. So the traders in Sudan cannot, they can still come into northern Barghazal, but they can no longer buy livestock because they cannot take them further to Fashir or to Khartoum because there is a conflict in those areas. This, however, has affected local market and also household income level in northern Bargazal because many young men have lost their work and also people cannot sell their livestock anymore. And this is affecting the overall economy, local economy in the region. And I picked the point some people made about the spillover of conflict in Sudan to South Sudan. If this war escalated into East Darfur, expand to East Darfur and Western Kordofan, the chances of recruiting young men, unemployed young men in South Sudan into the Sudanese conflict is very high because they are unemployed. They will look for opportunities. It could be risking their life to join an organization or an actor in the Sudanese conflict to fight in Sudan. So, and I will stop there because my time is short. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's hear from Ikal and then Simon.
Thank you. This has been the test of a pastoralist, sitting still for this long without either moving. It's the biggest test. My name is Ikal. I work with Friends of Lake Turkana. I'm not so sure whether to identify myself as Ataker Turkana because when people talk about communities, the whole morning I've been hearing communities and I'm figuring where I sit in that community narrative. My grandfather comes from Karamoja. My father is from Turkana. I am raised in Turkana, so where I fit in this cross-border conversation of communities, as a researcher, as a community, as a pastoralist, where exactly do I fit in the narrative of communities? Because sometimes we throw those words around communities, and I'm always thinking about which community. Key things that I'd sort of throw out there is, so when Diing was talking about trading, I would question it because I know most pastoralists, myself included, we keep our animals and only sell it for particular purposes. Hence, if somebody analyzed the markets built across the borderlands, they do not really function. It's a lot of wasted money because we sell on the road as we move to that imagined market because we just, it's a need basis. Yep. Thank you. Doesn't work. It has refused to be. A system issue. I think it's a. Yeah, I think I can keep going and shout. Yeah. So it really is when people, because we trade basic. It's not like you plan. You literally are needing something. Either you have a child in hospital. There's a particular reason, and that's why the aspect of trade. We're talking about economies. When you're moving with your animals for water and pasture, at that particular time, if you need grain, you sell a boat to buy things. And so the thinking around what is fall, what's not fall, what is an with XCEPT was very interesting, and Pasha will get into it more in terms of the methodology because it was the tensions. Why I started with the fact that I'm a pastoralist, I'm an academic, at the same time I'm a researcher, because we were combining ourselves as academics, as researchers, but also with the communities. So at the space where Sagal, a woman from a room, is telling us a story from her perspective, is engaging with what we would call an FGD, in the same space with us, and again with women of her same stature, was a very interesting place. The narratives that come out from there, how communities interact with statements that we throw out there, sometimes taking them and using them, and sometimes questioning them. And so the question comes, where does the community fit in all our research? and how does their voice shape the public debate, even when they differ with the public debate? How does it fit in that? But also at the same time, looking at the space of security, because this is spaces that there's been no state for a very long time. In fact, in the Kenyan context, the state actually recognized its absence and provided national police reservists from the 1980s. And so those reservists, the role they play in providing security for movement across the border, and how that has changed, because at the point of the need for community policing to provide the security across, how that now is changed into a very securitized space where it is questioned by either our own government, but also the neighboring government. But the last part that I want to bring out is the gender dynamics, that even when we talk about it, it's the role of women both as you know, the peace builders, but also how some spaces, gender has been the sexualization of this cross-border life economies, and sometimes people don't see it and say the impact, the disproportionate impact of conflict on women, but also how that has changed so much at different levels, from older women to younger women, and that's really never talked about. So something that more work needs to go into, and I'll ask Simon to go into more detail around it, but it really is, how do we look at state in this case, because we're going to talk about national and subnational governments, what role the community plays in this, and how they really shape some of the policy conversations that we push, because most times, and I think the sister who spoke in the morning from Confluence was really saying about how policies are high, you know, policies are talked about, but if policies are for the people but not by the people, how is it that those same policies are about the people? And I guess a lot of deeper conversations that we can get into, but I'll ask Simon to pick up from there.
Again, thank you, Ikal. Like Ikal, I have so many identities. I'm a pastoralist. I am a researcher. I am a leader of a pastoralist organization. And me and my people make a living out of the borderlands of Kenya and Uganda. I start from where there is a problem. A lot of people don't understand how myself and my people make a livelihood out of that difficult context. We produce our livelihood on a communal system, and a lot of other aspects of our lives, including justice, punishment, and every other aspect of society is communal. And the issue is the formal state doesn't really recognize this societal arrangement. And this has been a cause of a lot of problems, including violence in these communities. We are fighting at the moment a newly resurgent conflict. Around 2010, we had a successful disarmament, especially in Karamoja. Unfortunately, we were not able to convince the Kenyans and South Sudanese to disarm. And 8 years later, that lack of policy harmonization came back to bite, because we got a few more weapons coming into the community from both Kenya and Sudan. But also interestingly, from the Ugandan sources themselves, which is why in Karamoja, people are affected by the conflict say, the weapons from the rest of the Horn of Africa, and indeed those of our government, have also killed us, including the armor that fuels that conflict. Anyways, fast forward 3 years later, and we stopped counting in July of last year. We counted over 3,000 people dead and over 800,000 livestock lost. 3,000 people dead is over 5 times the number of persons who have been reported to have died in the current Sudan Sudan conflict for perspective. But probably not a lot of us know how many persons have died within our region. And also that's also because of a lot of factors. Power is one of those. The nature of actors is the other. And the sort of feeling that the psyche of national and global communities has sort of been engineered to treat pastoralists' lives as less important. Anyways, I'm part of a very fascinating and interesting research process. And one of the things that I think would make value to this conversation, and as I have had a bit about it this morning, is that the community is saying interventions are leaving us behind. They told me recently, peace does not come on wheels, and that the interventions of government to dealing with crime and punishment are falling short of the standard of their own criteria as pastoralist communities. If not, those interventions have continued to reproduce violence. And so we have this very detailed understanding of how big this gulf is and how much it's continuing to cost us our lives and livelihoods. A lot of community level initiatives have been tried over the last few decades. And where they succeed, usually the government was not on the table. And where they have fallen or broken down after 2 or 3 years, usually the government was superintending the process. I can speak about the Lokiriama Peace Accord, an accord of over 50 years. In implementation, I can speak about the Moruitit, which was, bringing government on board. It lasted only a few years. And other negotiations for dealing with the conflict have not been as successful because of the nature of these efforts, especially also supported by NGOs, because all of us in the room, I'm sure, are not good enough when it comes to supporting community engagement. So the perspectives we gain from our research process really try and solidify for me as a pastoralist, but also as an actor within that context, that maybe I try and be a bit hands-off and observe from a distance as community processes are ongoing to be able to deal with the problems. So for us, who then is government? And I speak really from a position of experiencing, the difficulties that the interaction between us and government, which unfortunately is not going anywhere, is really costing us. We lose people on a daily, and yet we think we have the solutions, but the sort of architecture that exists does not enable me to be able to fix my problems. So anyways, I am in Nairobi. A few weeks ago, the raiders from West Pokot raided my village. I hope at least I get to eat some of the meat in Nairobi today or tomorrow, because this is where our livestock comes to, and when it's raided, it makes its way to whether it is Kampala or Nairobi, and sometimes they say they also get on a plane to Saudi Arabia. I think because of course we produce high quality meat products, and I think maybe that's why the meat here is very nice. What do I want to say? At the moment, the situation is not very good at the political level. If you can just give me 1 extra minute. We have been engaged with the government on a number of fronts, one of which was to work on a cross-border resource sharing agreement coming through very high-level persons in government. Our research has been able to influence that process. It complements in a lot of ways the UNDP-supported Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed by Uhuru and Museveni in 2019. Presently, and I think participants have asked me this morning about the Museveni's decree, or is it rumble? And so this is the environment. The government badly wants to end mobility, badly wants to end the entry of Turkana pastoralists into Karamoja with weapons, even if it cannot assure security. So this is the reality within which we live, and we try and negotiate space and influence. Yeah, so let me end there. And I hope you ask some questions, and I still have a few more minutes.
Thank you so much, Ikal and Simon. Tobias.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I will take some 6 minutes to talk about what I call the politics of circulation in the Somali borderlands. And I will share 4 key insights coming out of XCEPT studies carried out by our colleagues Ahmed Musa, Khalif Abdurrahman, and Mustafa Mohammed. And they did work in Galkayo, Lasanot, and in Gashamo, as well as insights drawing on a long-term research project on trade and state formation in the Somali territories, which we recently synthesized and published as this book. Just came out with Hearst. Here it is, and you can buy it at the Yahya Center. It involved some 12 scholars, Ethiopian, Kenyan, Somali, and Danish, mostly doing anthropological and sociological work. First point, trade is regular, it is not informal. The idea of informal and informality is very much misleading when we talk about economics in the borderlands of the Horn of Africa. Every day, small and large-scale traders move thousands of tons of commodities, livestock and mobile phones, textiles and construction materials, vegetables and beauty products, just to mention a few, across sea and land, on asphalt and bush roads. These commodities are trekked and trucked across multiple borders, social boundaries, as well as administrative, political borders, to consumers in primary, secondary, and bush markets. And this large-scale everyday trading happens in spite of dilapidated infrastructures, mostly, often insecurity of varying degrees, and often no state and public services. While much of this cross-border trading is beyond the remit of the state and doesn't follow quote-unquote official rules, it is not informal, but rather very regular, routinized, and mostly predictable. Cross-border trading follows long-established rules, practices, and conventions where and how to move, to secure, to sell, and transact goods across borders. If most of this trading does not follow official rules, it is because state policies, in particular customs, trade, and security policies, are out of tune with economic realities, and they don't consider local interests, and are often simply impractical. It is therefore, that's our observation, it is therefore the state and state officials of the region who are the largest producers of informality, not traders, transporter, or borderland communities. Second point. Borderlands, in economic terms, in trade terms, basically do 2 things. They circulate goods and they capture revenues. If we think in political economy terms, borderlands are significant because of these 2 processes that have very important economic and political ramifications. The first one is the circulation of goods. Goods always have to move. And second, the capturing of revenues from these cross-border commodity flows. Long and short distance trade networks spanning from China, the Arab Gulf to Kenya and Ethiopia and beyond. And in the process, they cross multiple borders and boundaries, physical borders, social and political ones. Without this circulation of goods in and across borderlands, there would be no meat in Nairobi, no affordable mobile phones in Ethiopia, but also no cut in Somalia, to name just a few examples. Borderland communities, let me use that problematic word here, play important roles in the circulation of these goods. Now, states, state-like entities and aspiring state builders, and that very much includes groups such as Al-Shabaab, all seek to generate revenue from commodity trading by imposing taxes, fees, and various types of payoffs. asking money for security, road use, and many other services. And now, XCEPT RBI studies document and provide an overview of some of these taxes, many of whom have not been registered so far because they're often very small-scale local taxes. An example is the so-called lifting the rope tax, right? So if you cross from one district to the next, a militia is going to lift the rope so that you can pass, and you will pay a small amount for that service. The political economy centrality, the significance of borderlands, is thus to be seen in this double function of circulation and resource capture. Third point has to do with the competition for state building revenues. It has to do with the materiality of state building. Where does the revenue come from? I'm speaking here about the Somali inhabited territories. Although we lack reliable numbers, mostly, it is clear that the control and governance of key trade and transport corridors and marketplaces are central for state building. The Berbera, Bosaso, and other corridors have produced the bulk of public revenues based on indirect taxes, right, so trade-derived taxes, of state entities such as Somaliland and Puntland. 80% of their budget derives from trade-derived revenue, from capturing revenue from the circulation of goods. Cross-border trade is therefore crucial for state building in the Somali territories, and there is heavy competition between political entities, including national governments, subnational governments, federal member states in the case of Somalia, local administrations, including county and district administrations in Ethiopia and Kenya, again in the Somali inhabited territories, but also Al-Shabaab, to capture or generate trade-derived revenues. This revenue is collected at international borders, at intra-regional borders, at district crossings, at local checkpoints, and of course at major sea and airports and marketplaces. Competition over trade corridors and trade-derived taxes between neighboring states are integral to competitive state building in the Somali territories. To simplify, if you want to build an administration or a state, you need to be able to govern goods. Without a trade corridor, you will never be able to generate revenue, except of course if you have generous donors and you can extrovert the income, right? So that's another business model where basically most of the aid will come from abroad. But if you want to generate resources domestically, you need, in the Somali inhabited lowlands, you need a trade corridor. Increasing number of state entities, so local governments, districts, regional states, are all involved in taxing and governing the flow of goods. And that's also why their prices increase, right? And recent studies documenting how many taxes, formal and informal, are being levied show just how much public revenue is being produced. Informally, unofficially, off the books. More states means more friction for traders and transporters, right? Every time you need to deal with another administration, it's a checkpoint, Al-Shabaab, it's this government, it's that government. And this slows the speed of commodities and increases the price, in particular for consumers. But it also allows traders to hedge different border, customs, and trade regimes against each other and to evade regulation. So sometimes transporters and traders will basically change the flow of the goods in function of, more convenient tax system, so to speak. My last point, and this is basically the point that I think is important for policymakers and donors and national governments. If you're interested in peace and state building, there really is a need to consider cross-border trade and transport corridors, not merely as a matter of technical infrastructure, but rather as key drivers of peace, conflict, and development. Relations between local borderland inhabitants, between borderland elites and national elites, this particular political settlement between these three groups, to simplify, is an important predictor of peace and conflict in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere, by the way. Much of this revolves around economic opportunities and constraints related to cross-border commodity trading. I therefore think, and I'm not the only one, this is a collaborative research project, that policymakers should therefore, firstly, recognize the relationship between cross-border trade and trade corridor dynamics, including the land-sea nexus. Secondly, harmonize competing corridor development in the Somali territories, including the recent upgrading and building of new seaports and other trade-related infrastructures, right? Donors are saying it's great to operate the trade corridor, but this has consequences in terms of redistribution of the benefits and costs for local populations, and it also increases inequality for some groups. And finally, I think there's a need to encourage Somali governments, or in particular the federal government, to hammer out fiscal federalism arrangements that take into account cross-border commodity trading and economic corridors and the different types of revenues that they generate.